Well, hi, I'm Diane Butler, and most of you know me as John's wife and better half. Um, and it's my pleasure tonight to introduce tonight's speaker, Senator Winegrad, who is one of my personal environmental heroes. There's no other way to say it. Many of you know him from the weekly environmental column that he writes for the Capital newspaper. He lives on Oyster Creek with his lovely wife, Carol, who I think is in the background somewhere. And he's an active birder and crabber. He's a lifelong Marylander and grew up fishing and swimming in the Bay, and he's been fighting for the environment most of his life. He started in the House of Delegates in 1978 after serving in the Navy, and a career which began as counsel to the National Wildlife Federation. After 4 years as a delegate, he was elected senator and served the greater Annapolis area with distinction for an additional 12 years. Gerald served as chairman of the Senate Environmental Subcommittee for 8 years, and he wrote, sponsored, or managed nearly all of the environmental legislation that was passed by the Senate during that time, including the Chesapeake Bay legislation, which is no small feat. He served for 12 years on the Tri-State Chesapeake Bay Commission and on the board of the Maryland Environmental Trust. He has received numerous awards for his legislative work, including Legislator or Conservationist of the Year from groups such as the Sierra Club, the Audubon Society, and many others. During his political career, the Washington Post called Gerald the environmental conscience of the Senate. Tom Horton wrote that he is the person who, more than any other, set Maryland's environmental agenda over the past 16 years. The Maryland League of Conservation Voters scored Gerald's 16-year voting record with a perfect 100%. And in 2002, Gerald was presented with the prestigious Lifetime Achievement Award by the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and was only the third person to receive that honor. Gerald is an attorney and was an adjunct professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy, where he taught graduate courses he authored on Chesapeake Bay restoration and wildlife management from 2008 to 2013. Gerald has spent most of his lifetime fighting for the environment, and he's still doing that today. Most importantly, making sure that Annapolis retains the last of its remaining forested land, which is a no small task. But this man is not afraid to fight, which is fortunate for us. So with that, it's my pleasure to turn this over to my friend and one of the most hardworking and tenacious environmentalists I have ever known, the Honorable Senator Winegrad.
Thank you so much, Diane. That's very nice. And thanks to everyone spending the time to care enough to watch this presentation on the Chesapeake Bay. So I do live on Oyster Creek. We are all really blessed to live in the land of pleasant living, where I was born, raised, and educated, and used to fish off of piers. Even at the Annapolis Yacht Club, no one ever chased us as kids. Some got upset when our dead toadfish we released might stick to their boats. And I used to catch eels, which foul your line, hard to get off. And a guy had an Italian restaurant. He was born in Italy. He loved eels. I was actually a commercial waterman, was about 12, because he'd give me 60 cents, which paid for our bloodworms. He'd skin them and fry them in olive oil. So anyway, I'm going to start, and there'll be plenty of time for questions, I hope. So I can't ask questions because people are muted, but this is a famous quote from 1609 when Captain John Smith actually started exploring around the bay. And I think we all agree with this, even though the paradise has been spoiled. And the problems began, of course, with that colonization, the English colonization, the ravage against the Native Americans. And then, unfortunately, the first thing they started to do was control and clear the forest. And then the wetlands, with more rapacity as we developed methods to do that, started to get filled in, which causes a lot of the bay problems, the loss of forest and wetlands. These are pictures Carol took from our pier. I usually ask people to ID the boats, the birds, and great blue heron. This is a green heron on our pier piling, and then on a boat line is a black crowned night heron. This is all on our deck, and that's my pier. I'm throwing a crab pot on the lower left. These are all relatives, brothers, my grandchildren, my brothers, nieces, my mother-in-law, cousins. And so we celebrate the bay with crabs. Sometimes we have 40 family members here in the summer with mini reunions with a couple bushels of crabs and steamed corn. It's a tradition. Some of the scenes, the upper left, Carol took at my friend's house from college. He played football with me, he was in my fraternity. They live off the Little Choptank River in Cambridge. Of course, everyone knows the osprey, and there's a rockfish, all the beautiful scenes around the bay. And this is in Annapolis with the boat taxi, the boat show, oysters being unloaded, and that's a female soft crab, it looks in the grasses. And it truly is still a wondrous ecosystem. Things have declined radically. The 1 million waterfowl used to be 5 million back in the 1930s, but we still have an incredible amount of waterfowl, the biggest in the mid-Atlantic, on the Atlantic side during the winter, with over 1 million waterfowl in the Chesapeake Bay. This is a Carol's picture with the tundra swans. Her last name is Swan. They had a boat named the Four Swans, her sister, her parents, that they spent a lot of time on the bay on weekends living on the boat, fishing. And so there's canvasbacks. There's also a redhead duck in here, and there's mallards and also skunk. The bay, amazingly, has 300 species of fish, and it would be a test for anybody to start naming them. But the fish here, the common one that no one eats, but that's so invaluable, a keystone species, because it's a filter feeder, as well as being a prey item for so many species, including rockfish and also ospreys, whose numbers have declined radically because of a Virginia ocean type fishery that's not allowed in Maryland. It's been banned in Maryland for 60 years, taking them to process them in the northern neck of Virginia into fish meal, and also for the hyped up omega-3 fish oil that people take for their heart conditions. And this is a rockfish, a striper. This is a spot. And this is a very common fish that you can catch and very good to eat, is the white perch. So first of all, why is it so difficult to restore the bay? An effort that formally began in 1983 with the signing of the first Bay Agreement. I think Virginia Trippi was involved in that. I think she spoke. The conference had 900 people, from Jacques Cousteau to US senators, governors, the whole list. And it was held in Virginia, at a university in Virginia. And they agreed in a half-page document just to work together the states. Governor Hughes was the linchpin that put this together. And that began the formal Bay program that was funded, interestingly, by Ronald Reagan, who mentioned this in his January 1984 State of the Union address, that we were going to restore the Bay. And he put $10 million in the budget to establish the Bay program, which is headquartered in Eastport. So these items tell you, I'm not going to read them all, but you can read them. So there's some real problems, that it has a incredibly large watershed, and that huge land to water ratio means you have to work with all of that landscape and all of the problems of runoff from that land. There are many pollution sources. We'll discuss some of them, but everything from lawnmower exhaust and car emissions, and emissions from power plants burning coal particularly, and also natural gas, that rain down nitrates into the bay, which is a problem with the nitrogen, all the way up to septic tanks, and things like agriculture, people's lawns. You could go on. The bay doesn't flush very well. I mean, you had at the head of it the Susquehanna, which provides 50% of the fresh water, and then you have the ocean, but it takes a very long time for that water to mix and then come out at the ocean, to flushing it back and forth. It's not like, for instance, some of the other rivers that are much bigger, like in England, where they have the Thames. They used to just dump the sewage in there because it flowed quickly to the ocean. It's shallow. There's a lot of agencies involved, 6 states, and we have a lot of people, and we lost a lot of our forest, beginning with early settlers and then aggravated by agricultural activities. The forests start to come back with the concentration of agriculture and modern chemicals as people move to the cities. But again, because mainly of development, but still because of agriculture, we're losing forest land, and we still have legacy sediment and phosphorus out there. And the worst is the lack of political will and the failure to clamp down on ag pollution. The watershed is huge all the way up. The Susquehanna River comes in right here in northeastern Maryland and goes all the way up into Cooperstown, New York. It drains all of these states. So how do you get New York involved in the cleanup, or the little bit of the watershed that's in Delaware? West Virginia has been a recalcitrant and is somewhat involved as long as they get the money. And you have 6 states, Washington, D.C. Think of dealing with 3,000 local governments with planning and zoning authority, a lot of authority over stormwater, forest clearing, etc. So you see a real problem. It's not an easy situation. Like Lake Tahoe has 2 states, 2 counties, and the committee out there to clean Lake Tahoe, it's a much easier, and they have a federal law, a by state law. So the 8% population growth in that decade of 1990 to 2000, there was 41% increase in impervious surface. In teaching my Bay course, we have a whole course on development, and we study demographics. So that's striking. In other words, people use 5 times the amount of impervious surface that was here just to accommodate 8% of the people, because we're sprawling. There's less people per household, 2-home households, as well as people building bigger homes and wanting to get out of cities and moving to ex-urban areas. People think it's just Baltimore City that's lost population, but it's actually other places in the Bay, many towns and cities. The loss of wetlands we mentioned, population is still increasing, and we went from this to this to this to this, and it's still occurring as we sprawl and develop more and more land. So what are some of the effects? Well, first we look at the living resources, the critters that live in the Bay, and not get into technical dissolved oxygen, chlorophyll A, and water clarity, which are the 3 touchstones under the Clean Water Act that have to be met, or the waters are considered impaired in the Chesapeake Bay. And most of the waters still are impaired in the Chesapeake 37 years after we formally agreed to clean it up. So our waters, all of the waters in Anne Arundel County, are in violation of the Clean Water Act because they don't meet the levels for chlorophyll A, which is a sign of too much algae in the water, too much enrichment for nutrients, and they don't meet it for water clarity, which is extremely important for things like bay grasses, and they don't meet it for dissolved oxygen, which is important for all creatures. So oysters are the keystone species. The Chesapeake Bay used to provide about 3/4 of the country's oysters. Now it's barely nothing. We've reduced them to about 99% of what they were. So we're at 1% of the population. Reduction's been 99%. And they take out 3 to 5 days. There's a paper on this, an old one by scientists at University of Maryland Environmental Center at Horn Point, that in 3 to 5 days, the oyster biomass in the Chesapeake could filter all the waters, the billions of gallons of waters in 3 to 5 days. Now it would take well over a year and a half or more to do that, and they settle sediment as well. And you can see the abundance of oysters. And these are the landings going up through 2000, and you can just see the collapse. The oyster used to be at 15 million bushels, and now we're lucky if we get 300,000. And the states committed in blood an agreement, signed agreement, that they would increase the biomass by 10 times. Despite over $200 million in federal state money, the oyster population went down. If they had imposed a moratorium and closed the wild fishery, it would have gone up 18-fold, and that's a scientific paper. I've called for a closure permanently, phase out over 5 years of the wild harvest, and then pay the watermen based on a 3-year average of what they caught to go into aquaculture. 96% of the world's oysters are in aquaculture. The Bay could be a oyster factory if we started to put the oysters where the water quality is good and not constantly harvest the ones that are surviving out in the wild. And one of the biggest waste of, well, I don't want to use waste of money, but one of the biggest expenditures on oysters is the creation of oyster reefs. And the states committed originally to a 10-fold increase. Then they canned that when they didn't meet it on oysters. Then they went to agreement that each state, Virginia and Maryland, would establish 10 new large oyster reefs where there'd be sanctuaries, no wild harvest. And Then they reduced that to 5 each. So Maryland's not finished their 5, but one oyster reef on the Choptank River system, including the little Choptank, which I've seen them restoring oysters there, an oyster bar. That one system, $55 million in the federal money. And in 2018, the total value of oysters landed from the wild at dockside was 6.8 million. So if you could give the watermen 9 times that money, almost 9 times that money, not to fish them, and we would recover our oysters in a matter of 20 years, 20 or 30 years, rather than continue to do this put and take. Plus, those oyster sanctuaries that are established, at least 30% of the oysters are poached by watermen. Rockfish is our state fish. It's the most valuable fin fish in the bay, and it is clearly the one that charter boat captains, commercial harvesters, recreational fishermen are after. The Atlantic States Marine Fishery Commission is the coastal federally monitored agency that regulates, and they are overfished officially and way below the key target thing is the biomass of females. And this should be a signal that we're at a danger point again, because the young of the year index, that is the reproduction, these numbers have been collected in the same way for 57 years. They have been very, very bad for the last 5 out of the last 8 years. And so I sponsored the moratorium bill and took a lot of heat from local watermen and local seafood packers like Woodfield down in Galesville. They used to ship them as far as Ohio, and charter boat captains when I was a senator. And that led to the eventual moratorium for 5 years. I testified before Congress. They enacted a strong measure too that forced Virginia and other states, and now it's regulated, but we really need to bite the bullet, and DNR has failed to do this, and we need a really aggressive thing to save our rockfish again. The shad is another collapsed fishery. Rockfish aren't collapsed, oysters are, but the shad was the biggest fishery in volume in the state of Maryland until the early 1900s, when dams and overfishing collapsed the population. And despite efforts to lift the things over the dams and move shad around and spawn them, the Bay program, the states formally agreed to increase the numbers, as you can see, of 2 million shad reaching the Conowingo Dam, where they go up, and these other dams block them from getting up to reach at least the face of the dam where they could be lifted up. That was so far off, as you can see, it was at 0.4% of that goal. They abandoned the goal. The Bay states abandoned it. Now they have a much weaker goal, and there's been a moratorium on their take in Maryland since 1980. So that's 40 years, and we still haven't recovered the shad fishery. In 2000, the states agreed to increase bay grass total to 185,000 acres by 2010. That goal is now aspirational. They reduced it to 100,000 by 2017. And in 2019, we had a collapse. There was a lot of freshwater flows, a lot of rain, and the bay grasses are essential. It may be boring, like when I was a kid, we called them seaweed. They were so thick, they sheared the cotter pin on the boat I was on in Round Bay with my buddy, and it was an unpleasant thing when we were about 14, having his father have to bring another boater in and pull us in. And his father kept glaring at both of us as if we did something wrong. We just got caught in a seabed of seaweed, we call it. The bay grasses are essential. They're nursery grounds for crabs. In fact, there's 40 times more blue crab juveniles hiding in the bay grasses, so they're not eaten when they shed or even when they're small, and hard crabs, than there are on barren bay bottom. And yet the numbers are abysmally low. They had been coming up over 100,000. So the signals from the living resources, oysters, crabs, shad, when you look at the bay grasses, the bay is really in trouble, and our restoration is not working like it should be to recover these resources. So 82% of the bay's tidal waters, this is from EPA, Bay program, are impaired by toxic contaminants. Many of these are not new. In fact, DDT, which was banned in 1972, breaks down into DDE and other compounds, and it's still out in the bay. And this is really scary. I like when we eat crabs, I like the mustard, you know, the fat, the yellow fat. And that's where in fish and crabs, any of the toxic chemicals would concentrate, but I still eat it. I'm a risk taker. My wife said she's not going to eat hers anymore because of cancer. And I said, well, if you don't eat it, I will. It'll double my risk. So she's still eating it with me. And so this was a wake-up call from years ago that fish in the South River, because I'm really close to the South River and I eat a lot of crabs, and they're bottom dwellers were the toxic chemicals. In fact, to this day, 21 areas of the bay have fishing bans or fish consumption advisories due to contaminants. I don't know whether most of you know this, but there's advisories about not eating too much rockfish, that you don't only should eat so many ounces a week because they have mercury, mainly from coal-fired power plants. Some of the toxics are still getting there, but under the Clean Water Act, the toxic chemicals really have been cut down very, very substantially that are still flowing to the bay under the Clean Water Act. This stuff really scared me too about the intersex fish. When we told them about the Chesapeake Bay, my colleagues in Pennsylvania said, you won't believe this, but our bass, the smallmouth bass, the ones they love to catch up there, they are frightened because they've been seeing intersex bass up there, switching sexes because of the contaminants. And you can see the other one, CBF just rated the bay a D+ in 2020. It dropped down. Nitrogen levels, which are a key bay pollutant, I'll talk about in a minute, got an F. That's how poor we're doing. And water clarity did, as well as oysters and shad. So what causes the problems? And if people that are watching this or listening don't take anything else from my talk, this is the most important thing to get and understand about what's wrong with the bay ecosystem. It's a failure to adequately address excess nutrients, which are nitrogen basically and phosphorus, and the sediment that mainly comes from non-point sources. That means not pipes, not sewage treatment plants, not industrial discharges. So non-point includes smokestacks, though, from air emissions, because that comes down from atmospheric deposition. So why are these nutrients bad for the bay and the sediment? I would ask my class or students or other people if you could respond, what are what's other 4-letter words for sediment? And they are dirt and soil. So the nutrients are necessary for our growth. They're necessary for plants to grow, for crops to grow, for critters to grow. And so what's happened in the bay, we've removed 40% of the forest that held in nutrients naturally and sediments. And we have spiked this up because of that land clearing and filling of wetlands that naturally absorb these. The forests are sponges and could absorb 85, 95% of the nitrogen. And nitrogen, it's important to remember, is water soluble. It dissolves in water. It's harder to control. So if you control sedimentation or erosion, which people want to do, especially so their creeks don't get filled in, you also control most of the phosphorus. So phosphorus binds with soil particles. And so nitrogen is the biggest problem. Phosphorus is also a problem because they enrich the water so much that algae flourish. And so when you see one of the touchstones of the Clean Water Act and why we're in violation of the act, besides water clarity and dissolved oxygen, it's chlorophyll A, which is a measurement of how much green stuff is out there, the algae. And so the algae flourishes, especially when the water is warm in the summer with all of this excess, all these excess nutrients. And so those nutrients create these huge algal blooms, can result in brown or red tides. And when they decay and go to the bottom, they suck up oxygen. And the algae is also thick enough to coat bay grasses, blocking sunlight from penetrating and causing the bay grasses to die. Sediment smothers the bottom, all the benthic organisms, excess sediment, and it also smothers oyster bars, so that about 80% of the oyster bars in the Maryland's portion of the Chesapeake Bay are useless for growing oysters. They're going to die because of the excess sediment and the major sources from agriculture runoff, and secondly, from developed lands and development. And so that is the core thing that we have to address, the nitrogen and phosphorus and sediment. And this hasn't changed in 37 years of the Bay program. to kick off the Bay program, Senator Mathias sponsored a bill, a Republican, and it took 5 years to do a study. It was supposed to take 2. It actually took 6. And they concluded that it was these excess nutrients and sediment, as well as in some cases toxic chemicals, that are the problem. And so next, to solve the problem, what are the sources of the nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment? So we know the problems with the bay and water quality and in the living resources. I just went over what causes those problems. And now here, what are the sources? And then the next lesson is, how do you address those pollutant sources? So when you see agriculture, what's frightening about this is that if you took all the human waste, and this has probably changed since these figures were collected, the municipal and industrial wastewater, all the sewage treatment plants, are almost equal to the agricultural manure of all these 18 million people in the Bay watershed. Well, it doesn't count septic, so it's less than that. So it would be 25% if you include septic tanks. So it's almost equal to the manure. Why? Because we treat the wastewater very, very well. In fact, overall, it's been a singular success of the Bay program, but the manure is untreated and just dumped out. The chicken manure on the Eastern Shore is enough to keep those rivers polluted forever unless something is done about the chicken manure on the Eastern Shore. So if you add agricultural chemical fertilizer, agricultural manure, that's 36%, and the deposition from the atmosphere, which people really don't grasp, that's 43% is coming from agriculture activities. And the one that gets attacked are developed lands. Everybody wants to go after developers, but not after farmers or agriculture, big agribusiness. And that's 11% in this chart. Now these numbers change, and I have to tell everyone, these are not for every single watershed. So the Severn River, the South River, the Western Road rivers, all around Anne Arundel County, because of the intensive development we have, we're a very developed county with little agriculture left. It would be overwhelmingly from stormwater runoff from developed lands, and it would be overwhelmingly from, the next would be from sewage treatment, wastewater treatment plants, even though we've cracked down on those a lot. So you have to understand that. You have to look at each river. If you go on the Eastern Shore, it'd be the reverse. Agriculture would be in the high majority of the pollutants on the Eastern Shore or in Southern Maryland. The atmospheric deposition, I don't want to run out of time, means that what happens is that when you put manure out on the fields, or some of the fertilizer, particularly manure, breaks down into ammonia, which you've smelled when you ride by those fields. The ammonia comes out of chicken houses with fans, and any manure placed on the soil that isn't tilled in and covered will eventually break down into ammonia. Ammonia goes up in the atmosphere, combines with water particles, and comes down as nitrates. And that's where you get a major source of nitrogen to the bay. And people are breathing that. Many people of color on the Eastern Shore, where they build these enormous chicken houses, and it's affecting their health, but the respiratory systems, and even higher cases of pneumonia. For phosphorus, very quickly, you can see, look at agriculture manure, 26%. If you took wastewater, it's even more than human waste, because there's very little phosphorus from septic tanks. Why? Because, as I said, phosphorus binds with soil particles, and so it's not going to escape enough to run into the groundwater or into surface waters. So when you look at agriculture, once again, 45% showing here. And runoff in streams is not that high, because that includes existing phosphorus that's already in the water system bound to the soil particles. You have to understand that. So it isn't as bad as that looks. And finally is the sediment that is very important to get rid of. And as I said, 80% of the bay oyster habitat is smothered with sediment and non-productive. And you look at agriculture, it's extremely high bay-wide. On the Eastern Shore, it'd be much higher. Here in Anne Arundel, it'll be much lower. So the biggest success in the bay restoration comes at our expense. We're all paying for this with a $60 fee named by recalcitrants as the flush tax. Now, what's interesting about this is that this was under Governor Ehrlich. Ehrlich proposed the flush tax, a Republican conservative governor. How times have changed. Right now, I'm sure Hogan would be attacking this like he did the so-called rain tax for stormwater, which was a different time, and the legislature bowed when Hogan won and actually repealed that, and instead dictated that counties, municipalities had to come up with some money to deal with stormwater runoff. So the flush tax has raised, with the issuance of bonds to pay it back, it raises about $80 million a year. And that money from anyone that's on water or sewer, we all pay $60 a year. It was 30, they doubled it. And the 67 largest wastewater treatment plants, plus now even smaller ones, that's over 500,000 gallons a day. 95% of all wastewater flows, I think we're up to about 97 now with the smaller ones, is treated through a thing called enhanced nutrient removal. It uses bacteria to eat up the nitrogen and phosphorus. And that has been an incredible reduction. But 84% of Maryland's nitrogen reductions that we're supposed to be reducing since 1985 came from wastewater treatment plants. That's 16% from all the other septic, developed lands, agriculture. And that's not going to be enough to meet our 2025 goals, which we didn't meet in 2017 under the TMDL for the Bay cleanup, which was dictated by the EPA under the Clean Water Act. It's very important. I'm speaking fast now, but that would take a while to explain. So we're not meeting the Clean Water Act goals and that were imposed on us, because what's happening now is these plants are going to be reaching capacity with more populations, as well as hooking people into the sewer that weren't sewered. And you're going to see that level off, those reductions. So you have to get much more out of agriculture and stormwater. Agriculture is the cheapest, stormwater is the most expensive to reduce. I sponsored the phosphate ban. It took 2 years, and then it spread to DC. I testified before the DC City Council, then Virginia, and then Pennsylvania. It was a major success and one of the few things that's actually saved money. In Anne Arundel County, I want to say the Department of Public Works does a wonderful job with our sewage treatment plants. But just to give you an idea, we have spent something like $275 million on our sewage treatment plants. And if they reach capacity, all of the nitrogen gains reductions are going to be negated by the population increase plugging into the plants. It's really kind of depressing. 275 million, most of it from the flush tax, and plus some county money as well. We have 1,700 miles of sewer lines and 289 pumping stations in Anne Arundel County. So no wonder there's sewer spills once some of them are almost 100 years old. So with that success, you see things restored like the bald eagle, which was taken off the endangered species list. So it's a symbol, our national symbol, our national bird, and it is sitting on a muskrat nest over on the eastern shore. And one of the reasons it's been restored is the protection under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, but it's also because we got rid of a widespread agricultural and public health chemical, DDT. Without that ban, the bald eagles would still be in trouble. So would be peregrine falcons and other birds like the osprey, who has a young rockfish here. And the osprey are affected because of menhaden declines due to the overharvest that Virginia allows. So 4 critical elements to restore the bay. Very important. Each of us is an engine of pollution. I tell everyone, it's not what the state's doing or the federal government or farmers or septic tanks. It's each of us. So I say, who polluted the bay? And raise your hand if you did not pollute the bay. Raise your hand if you did, because every one of us did. And that starts at 12 midnight. I'd run the clock to 24. You got a hot water heater when you're sleeping, even if all your lights are off, no heating or air conditioning, which I don't have on here, and you have a refrigerator running at the minimum. If you leave your computers on or lights, outdoor, indoor lights, that thing is run by electricity. Unless you got a hamster or you're powered by solar power with batteries, that's coming 20-some% from coal burning, the major slug, 30-some% from natural gas burning, producing nitrogens coming down into the bay, and I could go on and on. One thing I have to mention is lawn care. This weekend's article that I wrote and spent a lot of time researching, and women watershed stewards and master gardeners were writing me for months saying we got to deal with lawns. I was amazed to learn that 3.8 million acres of the Bay watershed, 1.2 million acres here in Maryland, are covered by turf grass. Most of that, 90% lawns. And that is unbelievable. 34% of Anne Arundel County is in turf grass, most of it people's lawns, 19% bay wide. And so if you aggregate the nitrogen and phosphorus and fertilizers, phosphorus is not supposed to be used anymore. That is a major influence on pollution, and agriculture must be clamped down. The senior Bay scientists that I started, all of us agreed that we needed to monitor better and enforce our laws and stop letting chicken manure and other raw manure being dumped by the millions and millions of pounds out on the lands. And it should be treated the same as what is produced as biosolids after the advanced wastewater treatment should have much stricter reg. We have to change development patterns. We have to stop forest loss. We got to plant forest buffers on riparian areas. It's one of the best, most effective ways to restore the bay. It soaks up the nitrogen, phosphorus, and holds the sediment. And new stormwater things should be a no net increase in pollutant loads. So agriculture in the bay, as I said, is the greatest polluting source with the highest ratio of cost effectiveness to reduce. It is inherently leaky, and the modern fertilizers have started to, they are the biggest polluter in the world, actually. And agriculture, organized agriculture, agribusiness is the most virulently anti-environmental group that there is I've ever dealt with, and I believe in the world, and certainly in the United States. Last year, 570 million chickens were raised on the Delmarva Peninsula. So if you took that and equated that to nitrogen, it's more than 1.2 million people that is not rigorously regulated or checked. And most of that is dumped, that chicken manure, untreated out on the farm fields. These are not small operations. One farmer can grow 150,000 chickens at one time, and you can get 5 harvests a year. So some of them approach over 1 million birds a year, the way they're set up by the agribusiness companies like Purdue and Mount Air and Tyson Farms. And those folks will not take responsibility, the industry, for the manure. They leave it on the farmers. Just think of taking the manure from a city of 25,000 people and just dumping it on our land around us. That's what happens in the agribusiness on the Eastern Shore. Urban waters, as I said, like this Annapolis area, have extreme domination by stormwater runoff. The cost in our restoration plan in Maryland is $6 billion, and we're nowhere close to that. It's $1 billion in Anne Arundel County just to meet our limits, our TMDL, the pollution limits, to retrofit. And we're spending, maybe, luckily, if it's $60 million a year, we would never catch up and meet our pollution goals. And we cannot restore our areas, creeks and streams, unless we deal with the existing stormwater while not allowing new stormwater pollution to occur. Any development should be zero new pollutants from stormwater. And we keep clearing our forest, which adds to the problem. So if anyone tells you that the bay is being restored and we're doing a good job, this is what frightens me the most about our future. So we had hysteria, which I won't explain, down in the southern parts of the state of Maryland, with people breaking out with infections and all, which are heavily influenced down there by the chicken industry flow. So when these waters heat up, they create a lot of nutrients out in the water, a lot of bacteria. The nutrients heat up and create the bacteria, the algae, and the algae becomes feed for these different bacteria. And so this one is Mycobacteria marinum infection. It's a very common one. Rockfish have it, eating them. People are afraid to handle even fish. And you can get this from water contact or fish. And this is a mild case on someone's left arm. Now, this is my friend Bernie Voigt, who worked out at Merritt with me. And he lived on Plum Creek on the East Severn River. He went out one day to clean his deck chairs for a 4th of July party. He cut his leg on a rock, went in, told his wife it was hurting him. They put on some antiseptic and a Band-Aid. When he woke up early that morning, it was inflamed. His wife made him go to the hospital. He was in the hospital for 2 weeks. And that's what saved him. They got antibiotics in his body. And he showed me his leg one day when it was healed at the Merritt Athletic Club. And this is his leg, what it looked like. I hope no one's eating dinner. So not only that, when I started talking about this and showing this, Barbara Samarajek, who was our good county councilwoman for 8 years, she scraped her leg in Lake Ogleton and had abscesses requiring months of medical treatment. Her dogs were getting infections in their skin. Arlington Echo stopped letting their kids go out in the Severn River because of the infections. And then here's my friend, Jay Sadowski, who's the most honest car mechanic right here in Annapolis. He was a fisherman. He was fishing in the South River. He cut himself and he didn't get to the hospital soon enough. He got infected. It dropped to his leg. This is his leg, and he died a horrible death from this. He lost his car business too. He couldn't even work. And this is happening. This is real. The health department does not want you to know. I've talked to PhD who are specialists, toxicologists, that confirm that. She said it's not only in Maryland, it's all over this country and all over the world. It's very bad for business and very bad for the economy, for people that know how dangerous it is if you have an open wound to be out in these waters in the summer. So now you got to be aware of greenwashing. CBF engages in it, and so do politicians. Governor Hogan had the chutzpah to say that his skilled leadership after 4 years resulted in Chesapeake Bay as cleaner than it has been in recorded history. Now, that is definitely for Pinocchios. That's an out-and-out lie. I've written him a letter. He had the Secretary of Environment write me back an exculpatory letter, but it's just not true. I see Hogan in church periodically, and I try to talk to him about this, but I don't get anywhere. Martin O'Malley, who I know well, claimed on his website, Tom Pelton raised this when he had his radio show and wanted a quote from me, that he had restored the Chesapeake Bay. I mean, is this ridiculous or what? County Executive Pittman claimed he passed the strongest forest conservation bill in the state and admitted to me that that was inaccurate. It's not true. And he had pledged that he was going to support a no net loss bill. This bill does nothing. Crystal Spring, if you cleared 36 or 40 acres of trees that were down to 27 acres, they would not have to replant one tree under the county bill. Under the city law that Diane helped with and we pushed, they have to plant every single tree back. All trees, the forest will be back. All acres will be replanted. Then Holly Porter, who attacked me from my agriculture article, had some more of her the falsehoods. So one of my favorite scenes, because I was a Navy JAG, I went to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba to do court-martial work. I actually became a military judge. If you've seen this movie, A Few Good Men, Lieutenant Caffey, who was played by Tom Cruise, he's a ne'er-do-well lawyer whose father was an admiral. He's questioning him about a murder that was committed by one of the Marines. It's called a Code Red. And he kept boring in, and Caffey says, I want the truth. And finally, Jack Nicholson in this famous scene says, you can't handle the truth, son. And he goes on a long diatribe. And so a lot of people can't handle this truth because they're involved in making money off of the effort. And some of these folks are actually scientists. Some are with groups like CBF that depend on grants and money from people, including a couple $2 billion for oyster replanting, why they won't support a moratorium when they had twice previously when it wasn't even as bad. So I formed senior scientists and policymakers. We had 60 people, former Governor Harry Hughes, former Governor Glenn Denning, who's a friend of mine. And believe this or not, this is Senator Paul Pinsky. Now, some of you know he's chairman of the Environmental and Health Education Committee. He's a good environmentalist. And Howard Ernst is the PhD scientist who writes books on the Bay. And he conceived an idea that after so many years, the 28 years where we're supposed to have cleanable fish waters, that we'd use the Anacostia so close to EPA in Washington, D.C. It flows through D.C. This is Diana Muller. She used to be the South River Keeper. This is Fred Tutman. He's the Tucson River Keeper. So we bought these cheap painter suits, and we had an incredible outpouring of the media. This is a woman's with a TV station. This guy's in his suit. He's the mayor. He was the mayor of Greenbelt. And so we go into the polluted water, and the Washington Post wrote this big story that you can read. There was back in 2011, trying to draw attention to the bay. Joe Tidings, former senator, he was there, he spoke, but he wouldn't get in the water. He was too worried at his age about getting an infection. So this is the saddest picture of all. My maternal grandfather was William Messick. My middle name is William. His grandfather, his father, grandfather, they go back to the 1700s, English Eastern shoremen. And but for World War I would have maybe been a waterman. My grandfather went to a munitions plant, worked in Wilmington, Delaware, and then went to Baltimore. But my great grandfather, they're all watermen and farmers on the Eastern Shore. I spent a week out on Smith Island. I met some of these people. The decline of the fisheries, particularly oysters, these people moved and started working in the Princess Anne prison system. And it is the saddest thing. I asked Tom Horton about this. He said when he was interviewing these people for the National Geographic on their lunch break, they had napkins and they were drawing pictures of crabs and fish. And now it's pathetic. They can't make a living, so they work in a prison. And I know some of them. One friend I'm not going to mention that I went out with on his boat soft crabbing, he never went back to watering. He'd always call me, Mr. Winegrad. He was my age. Do you know anybody who wants to buy a house in Smith? I'm going to go back. He was living in Chrisfield and working in a prison. Well, guess what happened to him? He became an alcoholic. He stopped his oystering and crabbing. His whole, these people are different. And it's where these indigenous people, like descendant from the British, they have a funny accent. It's everywhere in the world. They're being put out of their livelihoods because of our greed and our avarice and our inability to address these environmental problems. So that's all I have, and I'll be glad to answer questions.
Thank you, Gerald. Oh, wow, what an amazing presentation. What's that saying about drinking from a fire hose? I mean, you did say when we talked to you earlier today that you're trying to cover a whole course and well, it was going to be 40 minutes. We went over. That's okay. We have a few questions, and I'm going to that we got in the chat. I'm going to actually the first is more a comment from Bevan Bucheister. Hi all. When I worked for the Chesapeake Bay Commission 4 years ago, we got the phosphorus management tool adopted, and this limits chicken litter application on soil saturated with phosphorus. MDA, Maryland Department of Agriculture, I guess, tested all of the fields on the Eastern Shore. This was under Hogan. We also got phosphorus taken out of maintenance fertilizer in 2011. Lawn crew equals farm acres. So sounds like they're trying to make some progress in the phosphorus area. That's good to hear.
Well, what you have to ask is, Bevan, is who's enforcing that? So the farmers, when O'Malley failed to do this, he put in regulations just as he was going out of office, because he was catering to the chicken industry too, and Purdue, because running for president, you got to go through Iowa and the farm states. Hogan's the same way. So when Hogan came in, the first thing he did was repeal. He canceled just at the last minute. They had 45 days. He stopped the regs, and then they gave him like 7 or 8 years. And trust me, it wasn't the commission that got this through. It was started under O'Malley, and it was being forced by regulators under the Clean Water Act, CAFO regulations. But the point I'm making is that very few on-site inspections are done of these farms. Especially, they use a COVID-19 as an excuse, but they might check the nutrient management plan they file about what they do with the manure. But that is done sometimes in an office, and they don't go out in the fields to see what they're doing with the manure. I can't emphasize that enough. These are what the scientists tell us, these PhD ag scientists. So the phosphorus management tool is a step forward. What that means is you don't put chicken manure or other animal manure on fields that are already saturated with phosphorus. And that's about 2/3 of the Eastern Shore. So that's been in effect since 1985. It's a ban for biosolids from wastewater treatment plants. You can't put those on saturated soils, period. So this is being done by the size of the farm. So the biggest first, they still haven't gotten all the farms on that. So it's a step forward, but
okay.
Don't ask about the enforcement.
Okay, that sounds like there's still issues to address there. From Bill Borwigan, excellent presentation, thank you. There seems to be an inverse relationship between those Bay environmental groups that get the most dollars from polluters versus those who are more intellectually honest and outspoken on what really needs to happen. Which Bay cleanup groups do you support? Or are there some that you think are doing a good job?
Some of the ones have had their money cut off because they don't play nice in the fundraisers and funding sandboxes. So some of the best are some of the river keepers, but not all of them. Some of them have been infiltrated by big chicken on the Eastern Shore, for instance. So they want to make nice with farmers and think just getting farmers more money is going to work. It's never going to work. I sponsored the Maryland Agricultural Cost Share Program known as MAX in 1982. And with Harry Hughes and John Griffin's help, that's been $150 million going to farmers to implement best management practices. But nobody checks to see how well they're being implemented or if they're continuing those things like forested buffers and animal manure holding tanks, etc. So what I'm getting to is that some of the river keepers are really, really gangbusters. You know, we have some around here, the Tuxet River keeper, Fred Tutman, the Assateague River keeper, Kathy Phillips on the Eastern Shore. They are the brave people fighting big chicken, fighting developers and all. The ones that have been taking so much money like CBF has fallen on really, it's really difficult to keep saying this about CBF. I won their highest award. I've worked with them since their inception, but on policy, they've just become preempted by so much money they have to raise and by being politically correct in a lot of the positions they take. And I could document all of this. And anyone that's involved, from Senator Tidings, they learn early that CBF is very, very bad on policy. And they're the ones that are hurting the system. So the river keepers, some of the good river keepers that I can tell you, Food and Water Watch is active in the Environmental Integrity Project, Tom Pelton and all, Eric Schaefer. They're very good at what they do.
Okay, good, thank you. You know, maybe it'd be good to, Diane suggested, to stop your screen share or go back to the very first slide, but maybe just go ahead and stop your screen share.
Yeah, we'd rather see you than the people in your last slide. There we go.
Okay.
So I have another question. So let me get to this question here. So it seems like, you know, from your presentation, obviously there's a lot of ways restoration is falling short. You see a role for outreach and education. It seems that more public support is needed to get behind the much bigger effort that is needed for restoration.
I completely agree. And what's happened is that the bloom is off the rose, that when I speak to some groups, I get very disappointed and I start to feel there's no hope, because I hear things coming back, and I'm sure there are more conservative people saying, we poured enough money into that big hole of the Chesapeake Bay. What are we getting for this? And people more and more are detached from the bay. There weren't swimming pools around anywhere around here when I grew up. I got my Red Cross swimming certificate when I was about 9 years old at Bay Ridge Beach, when there were no swimming pools. I was fishing as a little kid. I was on the water, you know, it was just it's in my system. But now people have swimming pools, they have internet, folks aren't as much vested in nature and the outdoors. So that's critical. And that, if you go to any meeting for the last 30 or 40 years that I've gone to on the environment, it's always more public outreach, more education. And there are a lot of groups doing that and trying. CBF has a good education program with the kids. Hogan has punished them the last 2 years. After 30 years of funding, he took the $400,000 out that runs public school kids through there. Of course, they couldn't do it because of COVID-19. It's an excellent program of outreach. And Anne Arundel County, under my good friend Steve Barry, the Environmental Education Center, my sister worked for him as an environmental educator. They do a decent job, but not every school does. So I completely agree with you. We need to get people into the system and into caring about this the Chesapeake Bay is our primary ecosystem here in this state.
Okay, good, thank you.
Thank you.
Another question from Greg and Christine. I have heard a lot recently about the effects of pet feces on the bay. Would that be included in the 19% agricultural manure section?
About what? I didn't hear that.
Pet feces. Pet feces, do you know what how,
Oh,
is
pet,
that
pet.
measured? Is that quantified? Do you
Pet.
know what that's? Yeah,
Right,
pet.
right. No, that would not be in the agriculture. That would be under the stormwater runoff. And I know for a fact, I saw alarming figures from a certain area of the Anacostia River, right near DC, right where the bridge goes in, the metro goes in there, because they had a lot of resident Canada geese as well as people's pets. And there was, when they actually surveyed the water and tracked down the bacteria from the pet waste, it was a good slug of it coming from pet waste. So pet waste, I've never seen a figure, a hard figure, except for that Anacostia River study, just one segment, but it is included in the stormwater runoff figure from urban areas that runs off, and it can be a problem with it can be a problem, but I don't think it is anywhere close to just chicken manure. It would be like an infinitesimally small number, because there were, like I showed you, there were 570 million chickens, and that's a lot of poop, and most of it's going out on the land. So pet
Right.
waste needs to be addressed.
Yeah. We have a question from Greg Walker. Does heavy traffic increase deposits on the roadways which end up in runoff? Are we testing for these residues in the creeks? And if not, should we?
Well, no doubt, Greg's our traffic guru on Crystal Spring thing and of all things traffic related. But the answer is, of course, Greg knows that the traffic jams, you're polluting more at low speeds and you're idling. So yes, but does anyone actually measure those emissions impact on a local creek? And the answer is no, because that is measured in the gross feature of what comes down from the atmosphere as a non-point source. One thing I didn't address is that about 25 to 30%, depending on what you look at, of the nitrogen in the bay comes from atmospheric deposition, but that includes power plants burning coal and natural gas, fossil fuels, and it comes from all transportation sources. So it is a big slug, and you can tease those two out, but you can't say that in one particular watershed, this amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, or toxic chemicals comes from automobiles in that particular area now.
Gerald, I have a question. You talked a little bit about Menhaden and what's happening in Virginia. And if we can restore the Menhaden population, obviously we'll be restoring rockfish and the ecosystems will improve. Is there anything we can do, because this is all happening in Virginia? What influence can we have over the Omega Menhaden processing manufacturing businesses?
It's very difficult in fishery management. The Atlantic States Marine Fishery Commission is the interstate body, and CBF worked on this, but what they got was a limit, a cap that was so high, it exceeded what they were harvesting. And then when they went in excess, they didn't get punished enough. So that commission is from Maine to Florida, and I dealt with them in cracking down on horseshoe crab harvest. We were actually successful with a coalition I put together with multi-states and New Jersey Audubon and the National Audubon and Defenders of Wildlife when I worked for American Bird Conservancy. So the answer is that Virginia needs to have the pressure brought on them, but in the Northern Neck, that Menhaden plant employs hundreds of people where they process these. These are like ocean-going vessels that put out a smaller boat with a huge net and encircle the fish using airplanes to spot these schools of Menhaden. They can swoop up millions of pounds in one vessel and they process them. And so it's been a problem that's ongoing for about 20 years. And there's been efforts to crack it, but so far, no luck. They've put some restrictions on them, but that is a keystone species, and it's particularly important for the whole food chain, rockfish and ospreys, and so it's a very worrisome, but it isn't at the core of the problems with rockfish. That's part of it, but part of it is the pollution, especially of spawning streams, global warming, the water's getting warmer for the fish to be able to successfully spawn, their young to survive. And then thirdly, no doubt we've got to crack down on the harvest. The harvest is always the easiest thing to do. It's harder on the people that take the fish to recreational charter boats and the commercial watermen.
And you mentioned a little bit about the moratorium on rockfish that you were successful in passing. Are there any such moratoriums pending now or being considered on rockfish?
No, and I don't think there should be a total closure. I really don't think we're at that point. But at that point, when I sponsored the bill and took a lot of heat, it was my most embarrassing hearing I ever had. There were so many people against it. They had to use the joint hearing room, the big joint hearing room in the main legislative service building. And through Tory Brown putting pressure under Harry Hughes, I barely had anyone in this state, even people that put me up. CBF took a walk, and the bill did not pass, but they used it as a vehicle for another bill, and they put it in the legislature. I tried to get it. I offered an amendment, and I got like 17 votes. I needed 24 to pass it. I needed 25, actually, one more than the majority. And so what happened is it gave DNR, after I took all the hits and the lightning bolts, it gave DNR enough gumption that when another Young of the Year index came out that September, they announced a total moratorium beginning on January 1st, 1985. And that led to a 5-year stop in Maryland, and the other states were brought in. I testified before Congress, and that got the Atlantic States Marine Fishery Commission involved for the first time. So the answer is that there shouldn't be a moratorium on rockfish. There should be a phased out 5-year closure on the oyster wild harvest, shifting those people and paying them to get into aquaculture.
Yeah, actually, so that's a great lead into my next question, which is you were talking about oysters. We've got an amazing oyster group within the yacht club here, and they do tremendous work. So you mentioned paying watermen to go into aquaculture. Is there any way we can support this? Are there any serious bills pending or being considered?
No, I hate to say this, but my senator, who I supported, sent a letter for Sarah Elfreth, has bought into the CBF and to the scientist thing of a 2-year study, and we're in the 2nd year, that would do nothing to advance oyster conservation, in my opinion. It's packed to get it passed with almost no dissenting votes. About 60% of the appointees that vote are watermen or representatives of the oyster packing industry. They're all oyster harvesters or sellers related, 60%, and they must have a 75% majority vote for any measure they vote on. The thing is a waste of time. We've already studied it enough, and I have tried my best to convince her of this, but Hogan overrode, vetoed it, which I agreed with. We already had a fishery management plan for oysters, and then they overrode his veto. I tried my best, but with CBF not supporting it, I went down and I met with the CBF leadership. I met with their oyster person, their chief scientist, and I got nowhere. It's like I'm running out of breath with them, and it just doesn't make sense. But what I found out is that CBF was getting, I think it's 2 million. I have to look whether it's 4. They were getting either 2 or 4 million over 2 years from this federal largesse that's being spread out to plant oysters and to do where you grow oysters like I do around my pier. Most of them, the baby spat, the young oysters attached to the shell, they die because the water quality is so bad. And so the econometrics of that, of cars, Mercedes SUVs getting a bag of oysters and feel good growing it by their pier, it makes you feel good. But really, it would be best if they took that money and gave it to watermen and to get them out of the harvest of it. So the answer is, I am unequivocally convinced that those millions of dollars for CBF to help with oyster planting and to do the ones they give to people too, they also do some planning, is behind why they won't take the position. In 2010, they said, Bill Goldsboro published a thing that we should have, I'm sorry, in 1991, Bill Goldsboro published a thing while I was in office that there should be a 3-year moratorium on oysters to let them recover. Then in 2010, they had a white paper that said, CBF believes that we should phase out the wild oyster harvest and replace it with aquaculture. And I have those papers. I mean, I know this. I have it for facts. I showed it to the CBF people. And so the oyster harvest, the oyster numbers are even worse. And now they just have totally ignored that. So without CBF, because almost no other groups do fisheries management, the Coastal Conservation Commission does, but mainly on finfish, because they're fishermen. So the answer is that we're kind of on a dead end, and DNR is going to do nothing that upsets the commercial watermen because of Hogan's rural base and wanting to run for president.
Okay, thank you. We're running out of time, but I do want to ask one more question that came in that turn our attention towards another organization from Elvia. Wanted to know what you thought of the job the Bay program is doing. Maybe you have some insight into that.
Well, it's a good question, and right now, which I didn't put into my show, I was trying to keep within my 40 minutes. We are at a nadir. We're at the lowest ebb we've ever been in Bay restoration. The states, under the first Bay agreement, everything was voluntary. So we've had multiple Bay agreements, even with caps on how much phosphorus, nitrogen, and sediment each state was supposed to achieve. And that started way back in 2009 under a Bay agreement, way back in the 2000s, the early 2000s. And so folks knew at each Bay state that they had this cap they were supposed to achieve. It was voluntary though. If they didn't meet that by 2010, then under the Clean Water Act, the federal government, the EPA, had to, under a court settlement, had to impose restrictions that they had to meet so that you had a phosphorus number, a nitrogen number, and a sediment number. That was broken down to the states, and then it was broken down to watersheds, and then even to counties and municipalities. So Anne Arundel County has what's called a TMDL, a limit, total maximum daily limit on pollution loads of those things. Then they have to work up a plan called a watershed implementation plan. So they had until from 2010 to 2017 to meet 60% of the goal, and then the rest by 2025 or face sanctions. Almost none of the states, I think maybe DC was the only one because of Blue Plains and some stormwater they're doing with those tunnels. Maryland didn't meet its goals for nitrogen. It missed its goal and sediment, I think on one other. Virginia was the same, especially on that. Pennsylvania was terrible, and the EPA did nothing. They sent letters under this president. But the truth is, when Obama was going out, they didn't do anything either in 2017. The EPA Bay office here in Annapolis, they went to the region, the EPA region, and said, we want action against the states that didn't meet the TMDL. This has been pending for 30 years that we're supposed to be doing these things. And the region went to the DC office under Obama. And what I thought was going to happen is the feds were never going to crack down on these states because of electoral politics. Can you see them punishing New York? Can you see them punishing Pennsylvania where they need the states to win? Can you see them punishing West Virginia, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, you know? So nothing happened to these states. I mean, it was almost nothing. They withheld some money from New York for Clean Water Act funding. So the answer is maybe this will improve under Biden, but under Trump, it's been terrible. He tried to defund the whole program. He put it in zero in the budget. It was 72 million under Obama and just wanted the program killed. And part of that was led by the agricultural sector, who have tried to block the whole Bay cleanup in the TMDL process in federal court. That's the agricultural people that CBF and some of the other environmentalists think that they can keep flowing money to, and they're going to do the right thing. It's just garbage. The phosphate ban wasn't voluntary, and it didn't give the manufacturers money. It was a ban. DDT wasn't, a phased thing where we gave people money. It was a ban. Lead in paint, lead in gasoline, mercury in batteries. And all of the one battles have been by regulation and by laws. And so with agriculture, you need to clamp down or we're never going to win. And so I would say that the state of the Bay program, the last point, it's a long answer, but it's a involved thing. We're at the point now where Maryland and Virginia are suing Pennsylvania and the EPA, and CBF has joined as a friend of the court in suing them. When I'm arguing, and I've sent this to CBF and to the state of Maryland and to our Attorney General, well, why aren't we suing ourselves? Because we didn't meet the goals either. We did not meet the 2017 nitrogen. We're far off, and we'll be further off in 2025 because all of those wastewater things aren't included. We got to ramp up the agriculture so much and stormwater, which is very expensive to retrofit. So the answer is I think the Bay program was just barely falling apart with these lawsuits. In fact, Will Baker, in the court case, when they had the hearing, the federal government under Trump was arguing that these mandated requirements under that court settlement were not really mandates. They weren't requirements. They were just things that were aspirational that the states should be guided by, like goals. And Will Baker said, if that prevails, the Bay program, we're done. The Bay blueprint is done. We're done. We'll never restore the Bay. And that's true. That's the only, everybody gets money from this. So that's the carrot. Like my Maryland Agriculture Cost Share Program, 150 million carrots to farmers. But we also need a stick. And the federal government has laid down on the job, and that suit is pending. And I don't know what the results will be or whether the arguments will change under Biden.
Well, let's hope we can turn a corner into the Biden administration and make some forward progress. Thank you very much for your time. It's been a great hour plus. Thank you everybody for hanging in. I do want to, before we end, I want to see if my co-chair with Environmental Committee, Virginia Tippie, wants to say anything about our program for April.
Yes, great. Well, listen, that was outstanding. And thank you again so much, Senator Winegrad. I just want to say bravo. That really was excellent. I did want to just quickly mention that our next lecture is, our presentation will be in April in honor of Earth Day. We are having a panel discussion on April 21st on Earth Day Eve, and it will be with environmental leaders from around the local area. And it should be a great discussion. We have actually Jackie, many of you actually know Jackie Guild, a member of the EYC, and also deputy city manager for the city of Annapolis, and she will be our moderator. We also have represented the 7 leaders of the Seven River Association and the Spa Creek Conservancy and the Anne Arundel Rivers Federation. So it's going to be, I think, a great discussion, and we're really looking forward to it, and we hope you all will join us.
So may I say one last thing? I know it sounded negative, but the sewage treatment thing has been phenomenal. Trust me, that has been a major, major event with millions of more people, 5 million more people, and we've reduced. It shows we can do it if we have the will. And that was a Republican, a conservative that sponsored, it was his bill, his Governor Ehrlich's bill. But the second thing I want to say is, but for this coordinated effort, the study by Congress, by another Republican, Matthias chaired the thing, and funding by Ronald Reagan and our cooperative efforts, we would be much worse off. The Bay still is functioning. It's not like, we're not choking like you are from the Gulf yet when you breathe the air. But it's teetering, the cleanup is teetering as more people come in, more exurban development and stuff. And so there are improvements in some river systems. We know getting rid of phosphorus and nitrogen improves the water quality. It will work, and it's working in some of the rivers that have been dominated by sewage treatment plants. So I don't want to be that negative. There is hope, but only if we can really push the envelope and resolve these other problems, particularly on agriculture and loss of forest and development in the urban areas, et cetera. So that's really important. We were much better off now than we would have been if we hadn't had this program and all the efforts that have gone in by many people, even like in the Chesapeake Bay Commission, all the groups that have been working on it.
Agreed. Thank you so much.
And I just wanted,
you all.
I do want to say, I didn't get to all the questions. We just ran out of time. I couldn't ask everybody's questions. I know there's some people that probably feel like they didn't get their questions answered.
Well, John, if they'll send them to you or email to you, I'll be glad to answer them, because when I write my columns, I'm getting a lot of questions from people all the time, and I try to respond like I did when I was in office to anyone that takes the time.
Okay, thanks. We'll do that.
Thank you so much.
All right, Diane, you didn't mention one thing.
What?
How you worked when you were a law student on my big 82 campaign for the Senate.
I know. That's because I mentioned Mike Balanoff, and I didn't want to do
a volunteer.
That's right. We actually go way back.
I was 82.
I know. I'm not that old.
All right. Thank you. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.